I worked the graveyard shift at the only high school in a county that felt like it had been forgotten by time. It was a brutalist labyrinth of concrete, lockers, and fluorescent lights that buzzed with a low-frequency hum, the kind that digs into your skull after 6 hours of solitude. Most nights were easy. Mop the cafeteria, reset the chairs, empty the trash. But the school was too big, too dark, and too old to ever feel truly empty. It started on a Tuesday, around 1 a.m. I was in the West Wing, a desolate stretch of classrooms where the motion sensor lights were notoriously finicky. I was scrubbing a whiteboard when I heard it. A heavy, resonant thud asterisk from the East Wing. It was deep, metallic, and loud enough to vibrate the floor beneath my boots. It wasn't just a door closing. It sounded like someone had struck an industrial metal beam with a sledgehammer. I went cold. I knew the school's security system was foolproof. Automatic mechanical locks triggered by keycards. Nobody gets in and nobody leaves without an electronic log. I grabbed my flashlight and jogged through the central corridor, the beams of my light cutting through the oppressive darkness. I checked every exterior door, all locked, all sealed. I stood in the middle of the gymnasium, listening. The silence that followed was heavy, artificial, and thick. It felt like the building was holding its breath. I went back to work, but the atmosphere had curdled. Every time I turned my back to a classroom door, I felt an itch between my shoulder blades. I kept catching movement in the peripheral of my vision, a flicker of shadow, a shift in the darkness near the ceiling tiles. I spent an hour trying to convince myself that old buildings just talk. Pipes groan, metal contracts, wood shifts. It wasn't an intruder. It was just gravity and age. Then came the break. I retreated to the staff lounge, a small room with a single window overlooking the main corridor. I sat in a chair, leaned my head back, and closed my eyes for a minute. I didn't mean to fall asleep, but the fatigue hit me like a physical weight. Thump. My eyes snapped open. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stared straight at the glass pane in the lounge door. For a split second, there was a face on the other side. It wasn't a mask. It was a man. His features pressed flat against the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was looking directly into the room, directly at me. The moment our gazes locked, he jerked away with a jarring mechanical speed, vanishing into the darkness of the hallway. I scrambled up, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it would crack my sternum. I bolted into the corridor, screaming, "Who's there?" Nothing. Just the empty, cavernous throat of the school. I spent the next 20 minutes frantically pacing, armed only with a mop handle, convinced I was losing my mind. Hallucination, I told myself. Sleep deprivation-induced psychosis. I forced myself to finish the remaining classrooms, constantly spinning around to check the dark corners behind me. I headed down to the basement janitorial closet to prep the mop buckets for the final wing. The room was cold, smelling of bleach and wet cement. As the water began to fill the bucket, I heard them. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and rhythmic. Click, click, click. They weren't coming from the basement. They were on the floor directly above me. They paced the hallway above my head for a solid minute, then stopped right at the top of the stairwell. I stopped breathing. I stared up at the doorway at the top of the stairs, my hand hovering over the light switch. I waited for them to come down. I waited for them to walk away. Instead, there was total silence. Then, very slowly, a shape leaned into the stairwell light. It was tall, hunched over, and framed by the shadows. The figure leaned over the railing, looking down. I saw a flash of pale skin, the reflection of the basement light hitting a pair of eyes that caught the glow like a cat's. It was him, the man from the break room window. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move, couldn't run, couldn't even reach for my radio. The figure stayed there, leaning over the ledge for an eternity, watching me in the gloom. Then it hissed. Not a sound of anger, but a long, rattling exhale, and sprinted away into the darkness of the main floor. I don't remember running out of that building. I remember reaching my car, fumbling with my keys, and driving until the high school was miles behind me. When I called the police, they searched the place from top to bottom. They found nothing. No footprints in the dust, no forced locks, no sign that anyone had been there. But the creepiest part came a week later. I went back with my manager to get my final check and clear out my locker. While we were in the basement, we found a ceiling tile in the janitorial closet that had been pushed aside. Inside the crawl space above the janitor's closet, there was a makeshift bed made of shredded school uniforms and a pile of Polaroids. They were photos of me. There were dozens of them. Me mopping the floor, me eating lunch, me sleeping in the break room. Every single one had been taken from the shadows, from the rafters, from the very places I had been working every night for months. I didn't stay to see the rest of the pictures. I haven't worked an overnight job since. And to this day, if I'm in a quiet building at night and hear a metallic thud, I don't investigate. I run. The travel stop in Wyoming was less of a business and more of a scar on the landscape. It sat at the halfway point of a desolate 4-hour stretch of highway, where the only things keeping you company were the howling winds and the occasional coyote darting across the asphalt. It was a bleak concrete box containing a convenience store, a row of showers, and a laundry room that smelled permanently of scorched lint and despair. I took the night shift because it paid better, and I didn't have to deal with the soul-crushing corporate chatter of the daytime managers. Most nights, I sat at the front desk with my noise-canceling headphones on, watching the empty parking lot until the sun came up. It was 11 p.m. on a Tuesday when the world shifted. I was bent over the inventory log, my headphones pumping music into my brain, when a cold, prickly sensation crawled up my spine. It was the feeling of being hunted. I spun around. The man was standing just 3 feet away. I hadn't seen his truck pull in. I hadn't heard the automatic chime of the front door. He was just there, vibrating with a silent, aggressive energy. He was draped in a thick, grease-stained overcoat, his face hidden behind a mat of dark, tangled hair. His eyes, however, were impossible to miss. They were wide, unblinking, and fixed on my throat like he was memorizing the pulse of it. He asked for a shower room. His voice sounded like gravel grinding against bone. I handed him the key, my hands trembling as I avoided his touch. He took it, turned, and marched toward the back of the building. I sat back down, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm. I checked the parking lot. Empty. No car, no truck, no sign of how he'd arrived. 15 minutes ticked by. I could hear the shower running in the back, a steady, rhythmic drumming of water against metal. 20 minutes, then 30. The silence of the store became unbearable. I decided to walk back there, just to nudge him along. My footsteps echoed unnervingly on the linoleum. I reached the shower room door. It was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, prepared to see a naked man, but the scene that greeted me was far worse. He was standing in the center of the stall, fully dressed in his heavy coat, face pressed inches from the mirror. He wasn't washing. He was staring at his own reflection with an expression of profound, terrifying intimacy, as if he were talking to a stranger living behind the glass. I cleared my throat. He didn't turn. He just glanced at me through the mirror, his eyes shifting in their sockets, a slow, predatory movement. He walked past me without a word, his shoulder brushing mine, leaving behind the stench of stagnant water and old copper. I quit that night, but the owner convinced me to stay for one more shift. That was a mistake. The following night, around 2 a.m., the boredom was a physical weight. I grabbed some rags to clean the gas pumps outside, needing the cold air to wake me up. The landscape was a void. Past the spill of the store lights, the Wyoming night was a wall of black. As I polished the fifth pump, I glanced through the storefront window. My blood stopped circulating. Deep in the back hallway, near the shower rooms, I saw a flicker of movement. The man from the night before was back. He was standing in the hallway, facing the wall, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. I sprinted inside, my boots sliding on the slick floor. "Hey, how did you get back in here? The doors are locked." He didn't move. He just flashed that jagged, wide, impossibly long smile, a grin that reached his ears, showing gums that were dark and bruised. He was staring at the door to the shower room I'd used the night before. I pushed past him, and my stomach plummeted. The room was bathed in orange light. The shower curtain was already a shriveled, blackened wreck of nylon, and the walls were slick with pools of lighter fluid. The floor was ablaze, the fire hungry and fast, climbing toward the ceiling with terrifying speed. I grabbed a towel, frantically beating at the flames, screaming for help. Slam. The door hit the frame with a violent force. I lunged for it, but the handle wouldn't budge. He was holding it shut from the outside. The heat was becoming unbearable. I could feel the hair on my arms singeing. I threw my entire weight against the metal door, screaming, "Open it! You're going to kill us both!" Then, just as the flames licked at my shoes, the pressure stopped. I slammed against the door, and it flew open. I scrambled out, choking on thick black smoke, gasping for air. The man was gone. He had vanished into the pitch-black wilderness, moving with a speed that defied logic, disappearing into the dark like smoke caught in a gale. The police arrived 10 minutes later, but there was nothing to find. No vehicle, no footprints, only the scorched, chemical-drenched ruins of the shower room. I never went back to that gas station. The owner tried to call me for weeks, but I blocked the number. Every time I drive past a lonely highway travel stop at night, I check the windows. I know he's still out there, lurking in the black spaces where the light doesn't reach, waiting for another traveler to mistake his trap for a place to rest. The Olympic National Forest is not a place you go to find yourself. It's a place where you go to be swallowed. I was midway through a 3-week solo RV trip, steering my rig along a desolate arterial highway that wound through the damp, claustrophobic underbelly of Washington's wilderness. The trees here were monsters, colossal ancient cedars draped in curtains of hanging moss that turned the daylight into a perpetual sickly twilight. By late afternoon, the world had gone silent. The GPS signal died, the radio became a chaotic hiss of static, and the road ahead narrowed into a gravel track. I should have turned back then, but the isolation was seductive. I found a pull-off buried deep in a thicket of hemlock, killed the engine, and stepped out into air that tasted like wet rot and pine needles. It was silent. Not the peaceful silence of nature, but a heavy, watchful silence. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like the forest itself is holding its breath, waiting for you to make a mistake. I slept poorly. The RV felt fragile, its metal walls thin as paper against the vast, impenetrable dark. I woke up at 3 a.m. to a rhythmic thwack, like a branch hitting the roof. I sat up, clutching my chest, waiting for the wind to rattle the vehicle again. It didn't. Instead, I heard footsteps. Not animals. The soft, heavy crunch of boots on wet pine needles. Tramp, tramp, tramp. Someone was walking a tight circle around my rig. I scrambled to the window, my heart trying to beat its way out of my ribcage. I flicked on the exterior floodlights, flooding the campsite with a harsh, surgical white glare. The circle of light revealed nothing but empty trees. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was just a bear, but my gut knew better. A bear doesn't pace. A bear doesn't wait. I stood there, trembling, and then I saw it. A dim, sickly amber glow flickering deep in the brush, about 50 feet out. It was a flashlight, but it was being held in a way that made no sense. It was bobbing erratically, as if the person holding it were stumbling, or worse, struggling to control a convulsive, twitching hand. I watched, transfixed by terror, as the light began to move. It didn't come toward me. It started to trace the perimeter of my camp, hovering at eye level, moving in that same jagged, unnatural rhythm. Click. The light died. I waited. My phone was a useless brick, no signal. I reached for my knife, my knuckles white. 10 minutes of absolute, crushing darkness passed. I convinced myself they had left. I moved to the front of the RV to get my keys, passing by the small, curtainless window next to the main door. I didn't look. I couldn't look. But the pull was irresistible, a sickening curiosity that dragged my eyes toward the glass. The window was tinted black, a perfect mirror of my own terrified face. I leaned in, my breath fogging the glass. I saw a reflection of the interior, and then, as my eyes adjusted to the contrast, I saw him behind me. Pressed against the outer side of the glass was a face. It was smeared with dark, oily mud, the lips pulled back in a grimace that looked like a permanent, agonizing rictus of pain. His eyes weren't just staring, they were dilated, entirely black, and filled with a hunger that defied human logic. He hadn't just been standing there. He had been standing there for the last 20 minutes, watching me move, watching me tremble, watching me break. He didn't run when I saw him. He just pressed his hand against the glass, a long, splayed hand with fingers that seemed too long, too many joints, and let out a sound like air escaping a punctured tire. I shrieked, stumbling back into the kitchen, and grabbed the RV keys. The vehicle rocked violently. He was slamming his body against the door, the metal frame shrieking under the impact. It wasn't a desperate attempt to break in. It was a rhythmic, calculated assault. I dove into the driver's seat and cranked the ignition. The engine sputtered, died, then roared to life. I threw the rig into gear and floored it, the RV fishtailing on the mud-slicked road. As I tore away, the floodlights caught one last glimpse of him. He wasn't chasing me. He was standing in the middle of the road, perfectly still, his long, jagged arm raised in a slow, waving motion. I drove for 6 hours until I found a highway patrol station in the next county. When the officers examined the RV the next morning, they found mud smeared all over the door and deep, gouged scratches in the metal, not from a tool, but from something that looked like fingernails, driven in with the force of a hydraulic press. They told me there were no reports of drifters, no reports of camps, and that the area I was in was so dense it was practically unnavigable at night. But they didn't know what I knew. I saw his face, and I know that if I had stayed in that RV for 5 more seconds, he wouldn't have been knocking on the door. He would have been the thing standing inside it, waiting for me to turn around.